Obrigada, Márcia. Bom, eu quero começar dando boas-vindas para todo mundo que está aqui hoje conosco, participando desse webinar. Esse webinar vai ser gravado, como todos os webinars do IRELGOV. Depois disso, a gente vai adicionar legenda. Ele vai ser legendado em português e disponibilizado para todas as pessoas que acompanham os nossos canais, tá bom? Agora eu vou trocar para o inglês, então, para poder dar boas-vindas ao Rafael e começar aqui, de fato, com o nosso webinar. So, Raphael and all that are here with us today, good morning and good afternoon to all of you. Welcome to our webinar. I will start saying thank you to Raphael for this opportunity. We met a few weeks ago in Brussels when I was leading the IRELGOV's international mission to the European Union. It was a really great pleasure to meet Raphael by that time. And I know he has like a lot of knowledge and information to share here with us today. So thank you for this opportunity, Raphael. Thank you for making time to talk to us. Before you start, I have just like a few lines of introduction on our webinar, and then I will leave the floor to you, Raphael. So it's a pleasure to have you with us for this important discussion on transparency, integrity, and the regulation of lobbying, topics that are increasingly central to democratic governance and public trust. Today, we have the honor of welcoming a representative from Transparency International, Raphael. Transparency International is a global organization that has long been a reference in promoting integrity and accountability across governments, the private sector, and civil society. In this session, we will explore Transparency International's recommended standards for lobbying transparency, from clear definitions and public registers to meeting disclosures, cooling off periods, and rules of gifts, benefits, and enforcement. Finally, we will discuss how this mechanism can strengthen public-private dialogue and reinforce democratic accountability, offering valuable lessons for the ongoing regulatory debate in Brazil. We are truly grateful for Transparency International's participation and for sharing its experience in advancing integrity and transparency in public decision-making worldwide. So, without further ado, Raphael, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much, Lara, for the fantastic introduction. And of course, I'm very happy to be here present with you today to talk about our work around lobby transparency, specifically in the context of Brussels. Now, before I start, maybe a little bit of word about myself. So my name is Raphaël Kergueno. I am French, living in Belgium. Here you have, you're in my flat in Brussels. And I'm a senior policy officer for Transparency International EU office, working specifically on ethics rules in the EU institutions. And so I've been doing this now for over a decade, nearly a decade. And on the one hand, observing lobbying activities in Brussels, especially with all the transparency tools that we have advocated for, but also improving all the regulatory framework applicable to the EU institutions to make sure that as Lara rightfully pointed out, that lobbying is done transparently, with integrity, and with accountability. And so today I'm going to present to you some of the tools that we have at EU level. And before I do that, I will share a presentation. So here we are. This should work. Can you see it?
Not yet.
Not yet. You should be able to see it now.
Oh, yeah. Now we're seeing your screen. Thank you.
Fantastic. Now, of course, you did a great introduction to Transparency International, but maybe a quick reminder for everybody that joins us today that Transparency International is single-handedly one of the largest anti-corruption organizations in the world. We are present in over 100 countries, including Brazil, which I'm sure you're familiar with some of the colleagues working there. And one of the sort of the key, let's say, output that we have every year is the Corruption Perception Index, which allows you to measure the perception of corruption over time and the performance of countries in their anti-corruption work. Now, very specifically, I work for the EU office, so I actually represent the entire movement towards the EU institutions. And one of our key objectives here in Brussels is to foster an accountable and inclusive EU policymaking process. So before I begin on lobby transparency, I wanted to first introduce you a little bit the definition that we advocate for. And it's very important that we look at this because it also allows you to understand from which angle we're coming from when we talk about this debate. So the definition that we promote at TI, and this is TI at the global level, is any direct or indirect communication with public officials or representatives carried out by or on behalf of an organized group with the purpose of influencing public decision-making. And the very interesting part about this definition is that it's not so much on the type of actor that is involved, it's much more on the activity itself. So anyone that is doing this activity, that is involved in trying to influence the public decision-making process in an organized group, is considered a lobbyist. And this is very important because for Transparency International, we do not make any kind of distinction between the different type of actor. So if you are a corporate lobbyist, or if you represent a trade association, or if you are a consultant, or if you are a civil society organization, all these organizations fall under the definition, and that it means that there are lobby organizations. And why is this extremely important? Is because when we talk about the reform of lobby transparency framework, in my experience, the first thing that happens when a lot of organizations start to lobby is to make sure that they are not considered a lobbyist. And not being considered a lobbyist, not being sort of, for example, if you focus on only certain types of organization, it creates loopholes for every other type of organization, which means that only a part of the actual lobbying activities are captured by the framework. So why is this important? Now, one thing is very clear is that we really consider that lobbying is part of the democratic process. Every advanced democracy around the world has lobbying activities. And one of the objectives of a lobby transparency framework is essentially to professionalize it, the activity, as a first point of order from the perspective of lobbyists. And this is also why we have this extensive definition. But of course, one of the key issues with lobbying is that sometimes there are scandals that take place. And this starts everyone with the same brush. So there's no distinction between who was involved in the scandal. In the popular perception, lobbying has already quite a negative connotation. And this gets further re-emphasized once we have scandals. Now, I want to draw your attention to the picture that I have here, which is a quite interesting picture because this is the bags of euros that were found in the home of the Vice President of the European Parliament. And so this scandal actually pertains to the Qatargate scandal. I don't know if you've heard of it, but the Qatargate scandal, at the heart of it was a lobby organization, which was a civil society organization that simply did not abide by all the transparency and integrity rules that should have been in place inside the EU institutions. Now, of course, we have to be very careful because this is a corruption scandal, not a lobbying scandal. But the fact is that at the time of the scandal, if the sufficient rules had been in place, we probably wouldn't have resulted in this picture that you see here, which is money that was seized by the Belgian authorities. And to give a bit of context, this organization was essentially funneling cash from the government of Qatar to decision makers into the European Parliament to try to get favorable positions. Now, of course, this goes far beyond the normal kind of lobbying activities that we try to push for. And so very clearly, every scandal impacts citizens' trust, and we need to have a measure of protections for the public institutions themselves against undue influence, conflicts of interest, policy capture to the extreme level, and in some instances, also what you see here, bribery. And on the other hand, we also need some rules in place to hold decision makers and lobbyists to account, that is to understand what is the result of their interaction in the legislation that then gets voted on. So what are the key recommendations that we advocate for? And there are 4 key principles, so they're quite broad, but generally speaking, these 4 key principles is what we look for when we try to analyze a new lobby transparency framework. So the first is one that I already addressed. It's a definition that should really cover all organizations involved in targeting public decision-making, and very important, both direct and indirectly. And what we mean here is that directly is the meetings that you have, the phone calls, the emails, that is sort of direct communication. Indirect communication is, let's say, the communications you do on LinkedIn, Here in Brussels is a very special city because lobbyists have a tendency to also put posters in the metro station asking people to vote or against a specific provision. So this is all indirect communication to try to influence the decision-making process. The second key element that is vitally important is a public register that provides all key information to be able to identify the lobby organization themselves. So here we mean in terms of identification, we want to know what is the organization, what resources does the organization have, what are the interests pursued, the legislation, for example, that are being targeted. Vitally important in Brussels, maybe you'll tell me later in Brazil, but also the connected organizations, that is the membership of larger trade associations, or in case of larger umbrella organizations, who are your members, and also the public funding received. The third element of a sound lobby regulation framework is an enforceable code of conduct that really says what is and isn't allowed in terms of the interaction with the decision maker, and that is to prevent undue influence and also simply to promote ethical lobbying. And the fourth element is a lobbying footprint for transparency and accountability of the interactions between the decision makers and the lobbyists. And in my experience, it has taken two forms. It can either take the form of the publication of the actual lobby meetings, which is the case we'll see in a moment at EU level. And in some instances, it can also be the publication of lobbying activities, where we just see over time, we've done a lobbying campaign on this legislation, and within that, we advocated for certain positions. Now, the interesting thing about these four key points is that they're actually quite old. You see the document that I show here is the International Standards for Lobby Regulation, which was published all the way back in 2014. The crux of the matter is that it is actually very rare to see all four of these properly enforced in a lobby transparency framework. Now, today, there are already more advanced recommendations that are being, for example, promoted by the OECD. But I would say that it's really important that we get the basics right before we start going further. So my presentation will purely focus on these four ones. So what does it look like in Brussels? Now, in Brussels, we really have like a very extensive lobby transparency framework. We have what we call the Transparency Register, which contains right now 16,000 lobby organizations. So it really also highlights like sort of how big lobbying is in Brussels. And this Transparency Register contains most of the key information I highlighted. And a little bit down the line, I will show you what kind of information is actually being requested from the lobby organizations themselves. We have a definition that encompasses all actors involved, both through direct and indirect means. And we have a code of conduct that certainly bans certain unethical practices. Now, one of the key problems that we do have is that the lobby register in Brussels is a kind of framework where each EU institutions decide how they interact with it. So on the one hand, you have the European Commission with its own set of rules, and that you can consider it the executive branch. And then we have the European Parliament with its own set of rules, and that's the legislative branch. And then we also have the Council of the EU, but we'll come to that one a little bit later because it's both executive and legislative. Of course, in Brussels, nothing is always very clear. So they define their own rules, and that means that they have different publication requirements depending on who you interact with. Now, the good news for lobbyists in Brussels is that the only information that lobbyists themselves have to publish is on the register itself. But when it comes to the other lobby transparency publication, the onus is really on the decision maker. So it's the public authorities that publish. You don't have to do anything. And luckily, that's good news because otherwise we would be busy for quite a long time. Now, there is an enforcement challenge because there are only 10 full-time equivalents, so think 10 officials that are dedicated to verify compliance and data accuracy. So it's only 10 individuals that must verify all the information provided by 16,000 lobby organizations. And of course, in TI, we would say that this is insufficient resources to carry out investigations and to make sure that everybody plays by the rules. So what does it look like in practice? So as I mentioned, the Lobby Transparency Register has all the key information. And what I mean exactly by this is this kind of list of key data points. So you see here, there's an example for Transparency International. And down the line, I will share you a link as well, so you can actually look at it yourself. So we have on the first point of order, of course, the organization legal name, the headquarters, so the location where the organization is based, the individuals that are responsible for EU representation, usually this is the director of public affairs or the global director, depending on how big the organization is, and all the lobbyists that have access badges to the European Parliament, they're also publicly named. Then there is a list of all the key legislative files that are pursued. One key thing here as well is that we were actually requested to provide the exact legal references. So we have to put the legal references of each legislative file that we try to target. And it also helps everybody to really understand, okay, this is what you work on. We also must publish a list of our main communications activities. So, for example, any kind of report or policy briefing that might be published as part of our activities. We must disclose the participation in structured dialogue groups. So this is maybe something that is quite sort of EU institution focused, but the EU institutions create a lot of different groups that are sectoral. So for example, the group that will take about disclosure requirement for businesses, or the group that handles public procurement, or the group that handles the climate legislation. And these groups are structured, and that means that they ask experts to participate, and this gets then disclosed on the lobby register. And there's also a disclosure of the public consultations when there is one. Now, not always the responses as a vote here, but at least the indication that you participated, because you decide whether your response is available to the public or not. We also have the membership, so that's in case of larger umbrella organization, whether you belong to one or if you are an umbrella organization with your individual members. When it comes to civil society organization, here often is where we disclose the coalition of civil society organizations that engage together on one specific topic. Now, the important one, because often this is the one that gets a little bit tricky for everyone, and that's the financial data. Now, we do know that often organizations are not so keen to disclose the financial information, but I would say that this is really key information for everyone to fully understand what kind of resources is being spent to influence, and also for decision makers to make sure that organizations that have less resources available also have a chance to get a seat at the table, also have a chance to engage in the process. Now, there is a bit of an issue here in Brussels because the reporting requirements are different depending on the type of organization. So commercial entities have to disclose their lobbying budget, so really only the financials that is being spent on lobbying activities. So here we have to count, for example, the salaries of the lobbyist, the rent for the offices, how much money is being paid for communications, for travel, etc. So quite focused. But civil society organizations, they have to report their total global operating income and their sources of funding. And of course, for civil society organization, the total operating income is not all the funds that are dedicated to the lobbying activities. And this means that sometimes you get strange results in the data because this is reported in the same field. So to give you a sense of scale, for commercial entities on the EU Transparency Register, we have around 1.8 billion euros that is spent on lobbying the EU institutions. But then for civil society organization, everything that is reported is around 396 billion euros because we capture all the funds that are at the global level. Now, of course, if you had the same requirement for commercial entities, you would probably capture a percentage of the global GDP. And we think it's just better to make sure that everyone reports the same so that we can compare between the different types of actors. Now, another key aspect here is also EU grants received, so the public funding that organizations receive from the EU institutions, and this is for all types of actors. The one little extra requirement here is for what we call intermediaries. So these are consultancies and law firms, and they have to disclose their list of clients and the value of their contracts. So it's very extensive. And finally, the last bit is also a link to the internal code of conduct, because this was a presentation that given to the study group that came over to Brussels a couple of weeks ago, where we looked more on the ethics part. And you'll see that the code of conduct for the EU Transparency Register is quite small. And our advice always is to have a more extensive internal code of conduct to make sure that you don't fall into certain kind of pitfalls and traps. But that's just a separate conversation than the one from today. So when it comes to the EU institutions, as I mentioned, each EU institution has different disclosure requirements and different rules. So we would say that the European Commission is really the gold standard because they apply a very strict rule, which is called the strict conditionality principle. And very simply, the European Commission, if you want to engage with public officials there, it's very simple. If you are not registered, you cannot have a meeting. So no registration equals no meeting. And the reason why this rule is very important because it ensures that it captures all lobby organizations that are trying to influence the European Commission. To give you a bit of a sense of scale of how this works in practice, when they introduced this rule all the way back in 2014, the number of registration doubled. So it went from 4,000 to 8,000. And it's probably also the main reason why today we are at 16,000. Now, of course, you're going to ask me, why is it important to capture all lobby organizations? Is that we have actually seen in the past organizations in Brussels that are not on the transparency register. And therefore, they don't disclose who they are. They're not bound by the code of conduct. And some of these organizations often actually hide what interest they really represent. And that, depending on what they actually do, might make them fall foul of the law in Belgium. So what is really important is to make sure that everybody is bound by the same rules and everybody is transparent about what they do. And we have a level playing field. And so this is probably the best way to enforce it. Now, these rules apply to the commissioners, cabinet members, director general. So this is the top people in the executive branch, but also to managerial staff since 2024. These are more the individuals that are actually drafting the legislation and the ones we would be talking to the most when trying to influence the decision at that level. The other transparency element here is that these officials, and it's on them, not on the lobbyists, they publish their meetings and the minutes of the meetings. So you see here a quite complete example from Amazon. And in the minutes of the meetings, we have who was present, the organization present, and you see here on the example below Amazon, you see the transparency register number, who was present on the official side, and then a very short summary of what the meeting was about and a short subject matter. So this is actually quite extensive and it goes a bit further than what TI advocated because we've been more pushing for the publication of meetings in the first instance. But of course, having these minutes is also extremely valuable information for everyone. I would not for the moment know how it performs because I have to collect them. Just to give you a sense of scale, since the beginning of the current Commission mandate, which started in December 2024, we already had 14,000 meetings published. And so for the whole mandate previously, so think 2019 and 2024, where we only had partial publication, we had 26,000 meetings. And now for less than a year, we have 14,000 meetings, which means 14,000 meetings minute report. And we would need to do this analysis as TI to understand how it performs and if it's really beneficial for us or for the wider public or not. Now, on the European Parliament, things are a little bit different because, again, they have different rules. They do apply the conditionality principle, but it's different because for them, it's no registration, no participation in a public committee hearing, or no event on the premises of the European Parliament. So lobby organizations are allowed to organize meetings and events inside the European Parliament together with the political groups. But if you do that, you need to be on the transparency register. And this, of course, creates a problem because it means that essentially the register is not fully mandatory for the European Parliament. And if you want to meet MEPs, you don't have to be on the transparency register. So it doesn't capture all those lobby organizations. And we had a case recently why this could be quite problematic for the European Parliament because recently we saw in the meetings data that there was an organization called Heritage Foundation, which is a very influential organization in the United States that is not on the transparency register and that has been influencing members of the European Parliament. And for those that don't know, Heritage Foundation is the organization that is behind the Project 2025 in the United States. And of course, this really creates a serious integrity issue, if not a serious democratic accountability issue, because we would need to really know what this organization is trying to influence in Brussels. Now, when it comes to publication of meetings, all members of the European Parliament and their assistants must publish their meetings. And this also in the numbers shows the sheer scale because since the beginning of the European Parliament mandate, which was in June 2024, we already have 40,000 meetings published. So it's really quite extensive. It's just that what is there required is a bit less than for the European Commission, because we have only the subject of the meeting, who was part of the meeting, and who participated in the meeting. And what is quite interesting, a link to the legislative database in case it was really targeting a specific procedure. Now, this currently is done on a voluntary basis, but it's also quite an interesting best practice, because it means that when you go on the legislative database, you can directly retrieve which organizations were actually really active on that specific file. And that is something that I've heard is also very valuable for lots of other lobby organizations to understand who is either a potential ally, who could actually be competing on that same legislation. So a bit of sort of political intelligence foresight. Now, I'm not going to go over it in detail, but it just suffices to say that in the European Parliament, one of the main problems is in terms of ethics, because it has a very permissive system when it comes to the rule of engagement with the lobbyists. One of the key problems is that members of the European Parliament are allowed to be employed by organizations that are registered, so by lobby organizations themselves. And sometimes they're involved in paid lobbying activities, and sometimes they're involved in the same legislation for which the organization they work for is also advocating for. So, of course, this creates a situation of conflicts of interest, and it can be quite dangerous. My advice, generally speaking, which I gave when Lara was in Brussels, is just to not hire an MEP. It's very simple, because this can create a whole host of problems down the line for the lobby organization and the European Parliament itself. But it's allowed. There's also a short cooling off period, so it's easy to also hire an MEP at the end of their mandate. And another problem is that self-enforcement of the rules is basically based on the MEP themselves with no internal verification. So we cannot count on the European Parliament to try to enforce the rules and to ensure also that there's a level playing field between the different types of actors. So when it comes to the EU member state level, I mentioned initially that we also had the Council of the EU, which is the third institution that is targeted by lobbyists in Brussels. And here, the way it works is that each embassies of the EU member state individually is the target. So there's sort of potentially up to 27 different kinds of rules. It can be a bit tricky, but just in a nutshell, basically around 14 of them either apply the conditionality principle, so no meeting without registration, or they publish the lobby meetings in one form or another. So it's more like touch. But when it comes to the real rules of engagement, this really depends on the national rules, because the officials there, they fall under national jurisdiction and not EU jurisdiction. So very specific to Brussels there. There's good news and bad news on that front. Is that the good news is that there are some member states that have fairly advanced lobby transparency framework, the ones here that I named. So we have Finland, France, Germany, Lithuania, Czechia, and Ireland as good examples. But each of these countries do apply the sort of the four key principles differently. So, for example, one best practice is France. When it comes to enforcement, they have a fully independent authority with a lot of resources that ensures that the lobby transparency register is complete and also ensures that everybody applies the ethics rules. When it comes to, for example, Germany, they demand a bit more extensive information, but the onus is more on the lobby organizations themselves, where they have to explain in bullet points format exactly what they've done on specific legislation. In Lithuania, it's again a different system, which I think works more for smaller countries, but not large countries. But in Lithuania, the meetings are published, but both the public officials and the lobby organizations disclose, and then they cross-verify. Now we think that, yeah, I see that. I see that in Brussels, this is simply not feasible. Simply, if you see the volume of meetings to verify this, because by the end of the year, we are probably going to have 60,000 meetings for the European Parliament, most likely 20,000 for the European Commission. And if we think for the full legislature and we combine both the European Parliament and the Commission, we might come close to 700,000 meetings. So the onus is really on the public officials themselves to publish. And this is what we advocate for in the first instance. Now, in Ireland, there's also an interesting best practice, because in Ireland, they publish, proactively disclose the full list of officials that fall on the lobby transparency rules. And so it's very easy for lobby organizations to understand when they engage with the public institutions, to know this official falls on the rules, this doesn't. And if it falls on the rules, then there is a disclosure requirement of what the interaction was about. So that is for the best practice. Now, there are 14 member states that have an incomplete framework, and one of the key issues often is on the definition. And to give you an example very clearly from Poland and the Netherlands. So in Poland, which is a country of around 14 million people, the definition of lobbyist is only individuals that sell their lobbying services, so individual private consultants, which essentially results that for a country of 14 million, you only have 70 real lobbyists, and everybody else is not a lobbyist, and so no one else falls under the definition, and no one else has to disclose. So of course, this is a massive loophole, because it means that you don't capture 99% of the lobbying activities. In the Netherlands, it's also not a great practice, because a lobbyist is whoever the members of the European Parliament think is a lobbyist. So there is a lobby register where organization must disclose some key information, but it's only on request of members of the European Parliament that give an access badge to a certain organization. And so a lobbyist is whoever has the best contacts, and then obviously these organizations have privileged access. So this is also not good practice, because it means that if you are not considered a lobbyist by members of the European Parliament, of the Dutch Parliament, then you don't have this kind of access, and you are not on the same level playing field as other types of actors. Now, and to finish off, there are 7 member states that have completely voluntary requirements or no regulation whatsoever. Now, for those that do have voluntary requirements, we think it doesn't work, because voluntary, it means that only you capture those that are really willing to engage in this transparency. And it's very good, because it gives you a sort of a badge of honor to show that you are abiding by ethical rules and you are transparent. But again, most of the organizations will simply choose not to do so. So I will just jump a little bit ahead. So when it comes to the challenges in terms of reforming lobby transparency rules. Now, the one thing that I always get, and especially when there are reforms at national level where public officials and lobby organizations reach out for advice, is that no one wants to be labeled a lobbyist. So the first point of order is that a lot of organizations and individuals lobby to make sure that they're not considered a lobbyist, because they understand the negative public perception of this. The advice that we give and the work that we've really done here in Brussels is that we've worked very closely with public affairs organizations to highlight the benefits of being labeled a lobbyist, and to professionalize the profession itself, and essentially advise it in the same way that you are a lawyer or that you're a doctor, that you have certain rules in place that everybody has to follow. And in this way, we are transparent, we are accountable, and we do engage with integrity. So this is maybe an idea that you could also deploy in Brazil, depending on how advanced the lobby transparency framework is. But what is vitally important here to make this happen is that you need different types of actors to be on the same page. So the consultants, civil society organizations, some corporate lobbyists, and some larger trade associations. And this is also important because, just to link a little bit here with point 3, is that those that often resist the most lobby transparency rules, in my experience, are not the lobby organizations, but are actually the public authorities themselves. They don't want to be transparent about their interactions with lobbyists. But here again, the argument is, of course, that it is the public authorities that legislate on behalf of the citizens. They are the ones that are fully accountable for their decisions and their actions. And another way as well to say is that it also protects in case there is a scandal or there are actually issues arise. And I've seen this in the past, is that people say, "Oh, there's a scandal, this is unacceptable." But when they see that it's really transparent, it actually calms down a bit the debate, because people see, well, everything has been done with transparency, it's quite open, we can follow things, and that also protects the public authorities themselves. Though we know that, in the experience in Brussels, it took us about 10 years to come to the level of transparency that I just presented to you. So a full decade of advocacy on our side. Now, It's also important, as I alluded to, that the rules must ensure a level playing field. So we should really try to have the same reporting requirement as much as possible for different types of actors, simply because creating different reporting requirements most likely starts creating certain kinds of loopholes. Now, for example, if in Brussels, if you do not want to disclose your sources of funding, then you just create yourself as a commercial entity, or that you are representing commercial interest, and then you don't have to disclose your sources of funding. So this is the kind of loopholes that we really need to avoid. Another key advice as well is that lobbying data is often not published in a user-friendly manner. Now, of course, you see there's a tremendous amount of information that is published by the EU institutions, but we as Transparency International, we do a lot of work to transform this into open data. So we actually have to dedicate resources for this. And we think that in 2025, especially if there is a reform on this, that authorities now should just get it right the first time and make sure that everything is published in open data format so that it can be reused both by lobbyists themselves, by academics, by journalists, by other type of organizations. So it's really a public good of public interest, and the best way to do it is in open data format. And finally, the last advice is to make sure that any authority that is charged with verifying the information that is provided and that everybody does follow the rules must have enough resources. It's really not possible to have a fully and well-functioning lobby transparency system if the entity that must oversee it doesn't have the resources to check into this. And I think here again, the example of France is quite good, because their lobby register, which has around 3,000 organizations, we have 40 individuals that are dedicated to the verification and to investigations, but also to a lot of proactive communication. So it's not just about policing, but it's also about helping both public officials and lobby organizations with advice, that you can come with a question. And I've actually done so for France myself, where they explain very clearly what the rules are and how it works. And they're very patient. And this, of course, requires sufficient staff resources. So I know it was a lot of information, but I would really say that as key takeaways, if we just think of 3 key recommendations that we advocate for, is that we really have to push for a general and uniform applied definition of lobbyist across all institutions to make sure that all actors involved are properly captured and to prevent loopholes. We must have a very extensive register of lobbyists with all the key information needed to identify the organization and their activities, that must be published in open data format with an enforceable code of conduct. And finally, in one form or another, this depends really on the type of country and the type of debate that there is, but we must either publish the lobby meetings or the lobby activities to ensure that we have accountability of those interactions and to foster just a greater understanding within the wider public. So that's it for me. I'm very much looking forward to your questions. And of course, I'm happy to expand a bit on these because it can be a little bit technical, but let me know if you want me to engage in some of these subjects.
Thank you, Raphael. So if you have questions, please raise your hand or your virtual hand here, and I will make sure to give you the floor to have your question. But I would like to start on my side here with one thing. Here in Brazil, Raphael, we have this, like, it's a big discussion among lobbyists saying that, yeah, we should and we must be transparent, of course, but at the same time, there's this perception that we could be disclosing business information or strategic information while, like, we're doing our reports. So how to avoid this kind of perception that being transparent is equal sharing strategic information with, like, competitors or even other players or stakeholders on the field?
I mean, that's an excellent question, and it's a question that also came up here in Brussels. Just suffice to say that when it comes to the information disclosed, it is very sort of top-level basic information. We are not necessarily disclosing lobbying strategies. We don't disclose our voting records of who we engage with, because, of course, as Transparency International, we are lobbyists and we have a lot of preparation documents that go into our activities. Those are not proactively disclosed in Brussels. So what is really disclosed is simply the legislation that we're working on, and also the kind of like public communications that we have. So there's no disclosure of the emails that we send or any record of the phone calls. What is really proactively disclosed is the public reports that we publish on transparency of lobbying, for example, and those ones are on the lobby register itself. I would also say that obviously you have to think in a different, like a slightly different mindset, is that when we ask for this disclosure, everyone has to disclose this. So there's no sort of disadvantage between one or the other. Everybody has to disclose the files that they're working on. Everybody disclose their communications activities. But no one discloses their lobbying strategies. No one discloses how they approach decision makers.
Perfect. Not sure, like I think I saw someone like raising. Renato, did you raise your hand? No, maybe not. No, okay. I'm sorry. I will follow with another question here, Raphael, if you don't have like more questions from the audience. Here, like it's something that just happened right after we came back from Brussels. We have this this press company that during the past 2 weeks have been like disclosing a lot of information of metadata that tracks the let's say the lobby activity in the legislative branch in Brazil. And that there's a lot of information going on saying like, this is the footprint of lobbyists in the Congress. This is what they are doing, et cetera, et cetera. I know that we know that this is part of our democracy and it's like really normal and regular that private companies interact with public authorities. But here, I think we come across this problem or situation, let's say, in which the press has a lot of influence, of course, in the civil society. And when they write those things, even though they say that lobby is legal and is something that is part of our democracy, there's always this kind of perception when writing these articles that we're doing something that it's not really transparent, that we're trying to influence things that are not really good for society, but good for individuals or companies and etc. So IRELGOV, and I think all of the lobbyists in Brazil, we're trying to work to not only educate the press, but to work together with the press to show that what we are doing is part of the democracy. But at the same time, I know that a lot of us as professionals, we feel that they are hurting our job and hurting our reputation when they are doing this. And we are not really used to what I think you have in Brussels that you call watchdogs, that are doing this kind of disclosure of information to the public opinion. So I would like to hear, this is like the context, but I would like to hear you on how we could work together as professionals with the press, with social society, to educate them about what is lobby and to make sure that we can be as transparent as possible so they can, like, we can develop this kind of trust on what we are doing and really have like value of our profession or value perception on our profession.
I agree. Like, I mean, I can understand that this is an incredibly difficult subject actually to approach, simply because the perception of lobbyists among the wider public is fairly negative, and this is always a bit of a surprise, especially when you talk to younger people. I do a lot of these presentations as well, and I present myself as a lobbyist, and then the reaction is like, oh. It's quite negative. And so, of course, this is where that communication is really key because, as I said, that lobbying is really part of the democratic process. And when we look at the numbers involved, we really see like how vital it is there. So there are a number of arguments that we have developed, of course. Some work better than others, but the one key aspect that is really one that really works quite well when it comes to engaging with the press is simply to say that public officials don't necessarily have the entire expertise to engage in different files. Now, I don't know the numbers for Brazil, but I can tell you for a member of the European Parliament's office, they have around 2 to 3 assistants to work on a whole range of files. And then maybe 2 to 3 assistants at national level, but they mostly handle sort of like citizens interaction. Now, to give you a sense of comparison, if you look at a US senator can have up to 40 assistants. So there's a huge difference in terms of the amount of people that are working for you to get you the information. And I'm not saying that, you know, maybe it's a better example. The US has its own set of problem, but it also highlights as well sort of how vitally important it is that lobbyists are active so that they can provide the right information. And of course, where I think it also helps is to ensure that the public decision makers have a way of listening to all sides of the coin. Like, so if you had a public official that would only listen to civil society organization but not the other side, how can they really truly have informed debate and vice versa? So that's one that worked quite well in Brussels. But I would also say that sometimes it's just simply not possible to prevent certain more, let's say, negative reporting because of the type of newspaper that you're talking to. And there's press that can be a bit politically aligned, either very right-wing or very left-wing, and that will very much influence their perception. But suffice to say that one thing when I myself engage with some of the more partisan press is that there is simply no way, even with the amount of transparency that we have today, to truly say that access or engagement equals impact. That is simply not possible. It is not possible to say that because we had 20 meetings with the European Commission, that we were the ones responsible. We helped contribute to that, but we were the ones responsible single-handedly for engaging on the legislation, and that we are the ones that caused this legislation to be the way it is. And that leads me to also a final point, is that it is the decision makers that are accountable. Now, of course, we know we could live in a world where there is simply no lobby organizations itself. I don't see this world emerging at all. I don't think anyone is pushing for that, regardless of the way you look at it. And that means that lobbying is really part of the process, and lobbying is valued by the decision makers. But ultimately, the decision makers are the ones that are responsible for the decision they take. And I think here is where this kind of transparency on the decision makers is key, because they're the ones, if they are the ones that are transparent about why they took certain decisions and what their interactions were about, then most of the onus is on them. It's not on the lobby organizations. And I think in Brussels, when we look a bit at the reporting that you see inside the EU for the EU institutions, you often see that it is going to be a member of parliament or organizations X, Y, or a commissioner that took a certain decision, and they're the ones that are then having the difficult questions of why you came there. I don't say that this will prevent any kind of negative reporting down the line. I do think also that it's important to get a lot of different stakeholders on the same page, because here in Brussels, it's a difficult position sometimes for TI to be in, because we consider ourselves lobbyists, but there's a lot of civil society organizations that simply don't. And I'm the one actually doing a lot of the hard work, talking to them quite often to try to get them into this mindset, because it benefits everyone. From the moment that a civil society organization says we are not lobbyists, maybe down the line they don't want to be part of a certain loophole. This in Brussels right now is actually creating problems, because we have a very anti-civil society kind of debate and mindset, and people starting pointing fingers. And of course, this mindset and this debate could be flipped around the next time around. Maybe then the onus would be on corporations. And I would say we want to prevent the politicization of our activity. And that really benefits everyone, including actually, I think, the press as well, that can actually report sort of quite normally on the activities if they want to. But of course, nothing is foolproof here. The coalition is really the key. The messaging is very key. And for us, it's true that it took a while, because we've been doing this now for 10 years and it's a very slow process, but we're getting there. I hope this helps a little bit. I know it's a bit
It's not something simple, but it helps, of course. And my last questions, not sure, it's just a person saying that, ciao, Michelle, bye, thank you for being here with us. My final question, Raphael, for you is that here in IRELGOV, we always say that as lobbyists, we are part of the democracy, but more than this, we should advocate and try to work together to strengthen our democracy and our institutions. So how do you see this working in Brussels? How do you think like the lobbyists can work together with the public institutions to strengthen democracy and to help people understand like what is political participation and engagement for all parts of like public, private, and civil society together?
I think that's really an excellent question because there, like I said, in Brussels, most of the organizations that were in favor of more transparency, accountability, and integrity have been the lobby organizations themselves. So they have worked hand in hand, and they've done a lot of outreach to make sure that the process is fairly open. And one reason for that is that there are 16,000 organizations active here. And every organization would like to have a chance to also at least be able to speak or to have at least not necessarily a seat at the table, but an opportunity to engage with the process, which is something that didn't happen before. Before, it was a lot of like whoever had like the best connections, or who was the one that was inviting the decision maker to very fancy restaurants, or paid like nice ski trips for the children. This is no longer possible right now because we have this transparency element, but also because we have this integrity element. So we have this level playing field that is much more democratic than before because a lot of organizations, and small and big, can engage in the process. Now, maybe there is a little bit of some clouds on the horizon on this because right now, in the EU institutions, there is a bit of, let's say, a political move to close it down. There are some organizations that would prefer that it wasn't so open, that there shouldn't be public consultations, that we should use accelerated procedures. And we're coming back to a system that we had before the transparency register, where some organizations are privileged over others. And the good news is that this has created a lot of backlash, not just from civil society organizations, but also from a lot of even very large corporations that suddenly find themselves cut off. And of course, this is undemocratic. It's not the way we should do business in Brussels. And it also shows that there is sort of a common interest between different types of actors, but also certain decision makers that are now also decrying this, that it shouldn't happen. And hopefully we'll be able to make sure that we don't go back to the closed system, let's say.
Okay, so I would like to finish this conversation. Thank you, Raphael, once again for being here with us. And as a last message, if you could like give us some notes, highlights, or even advice, because we should be talking or discussing the lobby regulation pretty soon. It's another step to have the regulation here in Brazil. We should be discussing this in Senate pretty soon. What would you recommend us, or what we should be watching for or hoping for when like discussing this regulation?
Great, thank you. I would really say that build the broadest coalition possible. The broader the coalition, the more successful you will be in the process itself. And then the second really key advice, and it will sound a little bit strange, but really pay attention to the details. Because in my experience, especially at national level, there are a lot of things that people completely missed. And it's very important to be quite imaginative of what it's going to look like once the register is online, once all these systems comes online, because sometimes a tiny little detail means a world of difference depending on who you are. So it's vitally important to go over this line by line. And maybe also, just if you're interested, of course, is that if this law on lobbying comes to fruition and there is a proposal on the table, I'll be more than happy to help you with that as well and to look over it and to give you really advice as to how this would work in practice, because chances are one member state or one lobby regulation around the world has an example of what this will look like.
Okay, so thank you very much. You just found yourself some work to do because
Exactly.
I'm going to share like the
Please do.
proposal that we have, so
Mhm.
you can give us some advice and some recommendations based on the Brussels experience, and this for sure will be much appreciated from our side. So I would like to thank you once again and thank you all the participants. As I said, this webinar will be translated and we will be sharing it on our social media with all of our participants, associates here in IRELGOV, members, and the society as a whole, because we want everybody to have a better understanding of what lobby is and how they can like support us on making it more transparent in Brazil. Okay, so thank you very much. Have a great evening. Have a great day to all. Bye bye.
Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye
Have
bye.
a great day.